the cold wind drifting across the open fields of Pine Hollow. Idaho carried a quiet that locals had grown used to over the years, but in the spring of 2004, that quiet was broken by a disappearance that would leave the town unsettled for decades. 27-year-old Mia Carter, a soft-spoken veterinary clinic assistant known for her calm voice and gentle patience with injured animals, vanished without explanation after leaving work one late April afternoon. Her car was found 2 miles from her workplace, parked neatly on the side of a rural road, the engine off, the doors locked, and her purse still inside. No struggle, no footprints, no signs of distress, just absence, sudden and chilling. The clean, undisturbed scene stunned investigators, who immediately felt the weight of a mystery that made little sense. Word spread quickly across Pine Hollow, and neighbors who had grown used to trusting each other found themselves rattled by the silent unknown that had swallowed Mia without warning. Her family had noticed something was off when she didn't arrive home for dinner as she did every night. Mia lived with her older sister, Lily Carter, a schoolteacher who knew Mia's routines better than anyone. When the hours passed without a call, Lily felt a growing heaviness in her chest that she couldn't explain. She reached out to local hospitals, friends, her co-workers. No one had seen Mia. The overwhelming dread that followed left the family pacing between hope and rising fear until police officially labeled her missing. Pine Hollow police officers immediately canvassed the area, knocking on doors, questioning residents, checking rural paths, barns, fields, and trails. Helicopters flew overhead for 2 days, searching the sprawling farmland, and volunteers wandered through tall grass with flashlights even after dark, refusing to give up. But as night after night went by without a single clue, the town felt itself sinking into a collective anxiety. Mia was the kind of person who left warmth and calm wherever she went. Her sudden disappearance was a shock that felt personal to everyone who knew her. Investigators quickly began tracing Mia's last known steps on the day she vanished. At the veterinary clinic, co-workers described her as cheerful that morning, tired from a busy weekend, but still smiling as she handled appointments. She had spoken excitedly about attending a family gathering that weekend. There were no arguments, no concerning phone calls, and nothing in her behavior that suggested she was distressed or planning to go anywhere unfamiliar. She clocked out at 5:07 p.m. and waved goodbye to her colleague, Trevor Marsh, who later repeated that she had looked completely normal. Officers reviewed the clinic's parking lot and the stretch of road she usually drove. They found no signs of mechanical issues with her car and no reason she would have willingly parked so far from her usual route. Every minute detail only deepened the confusion. As days turned into weeks, the investigation widened. Law enforcement interviewed former co-workers, old acquaintances, and even distant relatives. They combed through Mia's phone records, bank activity, and personal belongings. Nothing hinted at danger or secret plans. The absence of evidence left investigators afraid that whoever had taken her was careful, calculated, or unfamiliar enough with the community to remain out of sight. Local media covered the case constantly, urging anyone with information to come forward, but tips trickled in without substance-full sightings, vague guesses, and hopeful but empty leads. The Carters stood in front of cameras, begging for Mia's safe return. Lily's trembling voice and their parents' heartbroken eyes became images the town would never forget. Summer 2004 arrived, and with it came an unsettling stillness around the case. Search teams had methodically combed every corner of Pine Hollow and the surrounding fields. Without clues, the search radius expanded. But the landscape of Idaho, with its dense forests, abandoned barns, and miles of isolated farmland, made searching overwhelming. People whispered theories at grocery stores, gas stations, and church gatherings, but none brought investigators closer to answers. Detectives continued monitoring individuals who had been in contact with Mia in the weeks before her disappearance, but no behavior raised alarms. The case was like a puzzle with pieces that refused to appear, each missing component weighing heavier on the community. Then in late August, a group of hikers traveling through a wooded area 15 miles from Pine Hollow discovered a small clearing near an old logging trail. They had stumbled upon personal items that looked out of place: an earring, a shoe, and a hair clip in colors and styles that matched descriptions Lily had given investigators. The discovery sent shockwaves through the search teams, who descended on the site with urgency. After careful examination, more items were found scattered through the brush. Within hours, detectives were convinced the area had been part of the crime scene. The mood among the officers shifted from hope to grim focus. They expanded their search to the deeper woods, their flashlights sweeping through the thick undergrowth throughout the night. The quiet surrounding them felt heavier than ever. 2 days later, beneath a layer of fallen leaves, investigators uncovered human remains. Dental records later confirmed they belonged to Mia. The discovery shattered any lingering hope of her safe return and transformed Pine Hollow's fear into sorrow. The Carters were devastated, yet determined to learn the truth. Detectives secured the entire area, collecting soil samples, fabric traces, and fibers stuck to tree bark. The remote location made forensic work difficult, but the meticulous hunger for answers kept them pushing forward. A few small pieces of evidence, though subtle, offered faint hints that Mia had not been alone in that clearing. The investigators believed she had likely been taken there, rather than arriving on her own, given the distance and terrain. Yet the scene lacked clear footprints, or identifiable objects that could point decisively to a suspect. Without physical evidence or eyewitnesses, the case stalled. Officers revisited interviews, reconsidered suspects, dug deeper into Mia's life, and examined similar cases across the state, but nothing matched the patterns or circumstances of her disappearance. News coverage shifted focus, and public interest faded. By early 2005, the case sat on the shelf in the Pine Hollow Police Department, filed under unresolved homicides. Detectives remained haunted by the lack of closure, knowing that someone out there had taken Mia's life and walked away unseen. Lily refused to let her sister fade into statistics. She contacted state agencies, private investigators, and forensic experts whenever new technology appeared, even if it wasn't directly related to Mia's evidence. But each call ended with the same frustrating reality. What they had was too limited, too degraded, too uncertain. The years moved forward, each one carrying the weight of a mystery frozen in time. The Carters lived in a state of quiet grief, their home filled with Mia's pictures and the sound of memories. They shared at the dinner table to keep her present in their lives. Pine Hollow returned to its calm routines, though the shadow of the case lingered in conversations whenever someone passed the rural road where her car had been found. The trees near the old logging trail grew denser, their branches wrapping around a secret the town believed might never be fully uncovered. For nearly 2 decades, the box containing Mia's evidence remained untouched, waiting for something the investigators didn't yet have. Technology had progressed since 2004, But the state labs still lacked the sensitivity to isolate DNA from the small traces found on Mia's clothing. Detectives carried the case forward in their memory, hoping one day technology would catch up to what the evidence needed. Mia's family continued attending vigils, their candles lighting up the night every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, a constant plea for justice that had not yet arrived. Then, in late 2021, as crime labs across the country upgraded their systems and improved extraction methods, Idaho State Forensic Lab reopened several old cases for reprocessing. Among them was a small envelope with a torn fabric sample from Mia's jacket. A new DNA extraction method, more sensitive than anything available in 2004, finally retrieved a partial profile that matched an offender already in the National CODIS system. After 17 years of silence, a name emerged. For the first time since Mia vanished, investigators had a lead, one that would change everything. When the forensic lab delivered the unexpected DNA result, investigators in Pine Hollow felt the weight of the moment instantly. After years of frustration, the case that had sat quietly in storage suddenly carried new life. The partial DNA profile recovered from the torn piece of Mia's jacket matched an individual already listed in the national database, Raymond Holt, a man who had been arrested in 2019 for a burglary in northern Idaho. Holt had served a short sentence and was released in 2021, living quietly in a nearby county. His profile had not been in CODIS at the time of Mia's murder. The burglary arrest years later had placed his DNA in the system, allowing the cold hit to surface at last. Investigators felt a mixture of shock and determination. Someone who had slipped beneath their radar for nearly 2 decades was suddenly within reach. Detective Aaron Miles, who had recently taken over supervision of cold cases, studied Holt's background with care. He learned that in 2004, Holt had worked seasonal labor jobs, construction, orchard work, and occasional hauling for local farms. His addresses from that time placed him within a 40-minute drive of Pine Hollow. There were gaps in Holt's employment history that aligned unsettlingly well with the week Mia disappeared. More disturbing was his record of erratic behavior in his early 20s, including several fights, alcohol-related incidents, and accusations from co-workers of aggression. None of these had ever escalated to serious charges, but the pattern looked troubling when viewed through the lens of Mia's case. Investigators realized that Holt had blended easily into the background of rural work communities, leaving few traces behind. Detective Miles reached out to nearby counties and state agencies, gathering all possible information on Holt's timeline. What he found deepened his suspicions. Holt had moved frequently in the early 2000s, rarely staying in one place longer than a few months. He took jobs that required little interaction, often in remote areas where supervision was minimal. Investigators reconstructed details through pay records, old address logs, and testimonies from previous employers. None of this proved anything by itself, but when combined with the DNA match, the pieces formed a picture that demanded a closer look. The cold case team convened, reviewing every document from the original investigation, comparing the locations where Holt had lived and worked to the route Mia drove daily. The overlap was undeniable. He had been in Pine Hollow territory during the week she vanished, with probable cause forming. Detectives began conducting quiet surveillance on Holt. They observed his routines, noting that he lived alone in a small rental house outside the town of Grayford, working odd jobs and staying mostly isolated. He exhibited no obvious threats to neighbors, but that did not lessen the weight of the new evidence. To strengthen the case, investigators sought a warrant to collect Holt's DNA directly, even though the CODIS match already pointed toward him. Fresh samples would provide confirmation and remove any doubt about contamination or lab errors from the early 2004 evidence. The warrant was granted after the state attorney reviewed the case file and determined the new DNA discovery justified further action. When officers approached Holt one morning outside his home, they kept the interaction calm and routine. They informed him that his name had appeared in a review of older cases and that they needed a voluntary statement and DNA swab. Holt reacted with visible tension but did not attempt to flee. He denied knowing anything about Mia and claimed he had never been to Pine Hollow. His answers were short, clipped, and defensive. Detectives noted the way he avoided eye contact whenever Mia's name was mentioned. His demeanor offered no confession, but it provided a strong sense of discomfort, almost fear that investigators would later analyze carefully. The DNA swab was collected, and Holt was released while the lab handled the new samples. The wait for results felt heavy for everyone involved. For Mia's family, the sudden revival of the case stirred emotions they had spent years learning to manage. Lily received the call from Detective Miles, who informed her that a DNA match had surfaced. Her breath caught in her throat as she listened, torn between renewed hope and fear of disappointment. She shared the news with her parents carefully, ensuring they understood that while the development was significant, it was not the final answer. They attended meetings with investigators, reviewing what the lab had found and what steps lay ahead. The Carters had lived in a suspended state of grief for almost 2 decades, so every new detail felt both heavy and necessary. When the final DNA results returned, the match to Holt was confirmed with certainty. The same profile was now found on 2 separate pieces of Mia's clothing, eliminating the possibility of incidental transfer. The evidence pointed clearly to Holt as someone who had been physically close to Mia during the final hours of her life. Armed with this, detectives constructed a detailed timeline of Holt's movements in April 2004. They pulled gas station receipts, spoke with older co-workers, and tracked down individuals who had encountered him during that period. One former co-worker remembered Holt showing up late to work during the week Mia disappeared, looking unusually exhausted and nervous. Another recalled seeing scratch marks on Holt's arm around the same time, though Holt had dismissed them as injuries from loading equipment. None of these memories alone proved guilt, but together they painted an increasingly troubling picture. Investigators returned to the wooded clearing where Mia's remains had been discovered years ago. Modern forensic tools allowed them to examine the site with renewed precision. Soil samples revealed microscopic traces of tire rubber, consistent with older truck models commonly used in farm labor, including the type Holt was known to have driven in 2004. A second search recovered an old rope fragment buried deeper beneath the leaves, its fibers degraded but still present. Lab tests detected faint biological traces that were too damaged to provide a usable DNA profile, but confirmed human interaction with the rope. The rope's knot style matched one commonly used by workers in agricultural hauling, a detail Holt's co-workers later confirmed he was skilled at. Investigators felt the weight of the story forming around them, one that had remained hidden in the woods for nearly 20 years. Detectives finally obtained a warrant for Holt's arrest. The morning they arrived at his home, rain dripped steadily onto the gravel driveway, muffling the sound of approaching vehicles. Holt opened the door wearing the same guarded expression he had shown during the earlier interview. When officers explained the charges: kidnapping, homicide, and evidence tampering, He stared at them in silence before lowering his eyes. He did not resist, but quietly allowed the handcuffs to be placed around his wrists. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, whispering to each other in disbelief. Holt had lived in their community quietly, almost invisibly, never drawing attention. The sudden revelation that he was suspected of such a crime left them stunned and shaken. During questioning, Holt maintained his innocence, insisting he had no connection to Mia. He blamed the DNA match on lab errors and accused detectives of targeting him without proof. But his story shifted under the pressure of conflicting timelines. He claimed he had been out of town during the week of Mia's disappearance, but investigators had paylogs and witness statements placing him nearby. His inconsistencies only strengthened the case against him. Detectives knew they had finally cracked something that had eluded them for years. The silence surrounding Mia's final hours was beginning to break. The courtroom in Boise filled with a quiet tension on the morning the verdict was expected. Marina Lowell's family sat in the same row they had occupied since the trial began, their hands linked together as if holding each other steady. They had waited 20 years for this, 20 years of carrying questions that felt heavier with each passing season. The light coming through the tall windows made everything appear softer than it truly was, but nothing could hide the depth of emotion in the room. The man accused of taking Marina's life, Clarence Royston, sat with no visible reaction, though the weight of the evidence had been pressing on him from the first day of testimony. The DNA match that surfaced in 2024 through an older crime scene recheck had become the center of every argument, every witness statement, every moment of the trial. It had tied him directly to the last moments of a woman who had only been trying to get home that evening in 2004. The jury deliberated longer than many expected, though the detectives who had worked on the case said it often took time for people to absorb the emotional load of something that had stayed unsolved for so long. When the jurors finally returned, their faces carried a seriousness that made everyone hold their breath. Marina's parents leaned slightly forward, their eyes locked on the foreperson who stood with the verdict slip in hand. The words felt slow but unmistakable as they echoed across the room. The decision brought a wave of quiet reaction, not loud or sharp, but deeply emotional in a way only long-delayed resolution can be. Some members of Marina's family closed their eyes, others exhaled deeply, and a few tears slipped down like the release of years of waiting. The prosecutor stepped aside respectfully, knowing this moment belonged only to the people who had loved her. Afterward, outside the courthouse, the fall air felt cool and grounding as Marina's family spoke with reporters who had followed the case for weeks. They chose calm, steady words, focusing on gratitude toward everyone who had kept working on the case even when years passed without progress. They spoke about Marina's kindness, her gentle way of making others feel included, her quiet humor, and the dreams she carried with her at the age of 26. There was no anger in their words, only a steady effort to honor her life instead of the circumstances that ended it. The detectives stood nearby, giving them space while still ready to answer questions. For them, this case had become more than a file in a cabinet. It had been a promised one they had finally been able to keep. As the day went on, the community in Idaho reacted quietly but strongly. People who remembered seeing Marina in town back then, people who had heard of the case only through local conversations, people who had simply hoped to see answers one day, all of them carried a sense of relief that felt almost like a breath returning after holding it for years. The case had become a reminder that time could delay truth, but it could not erase it. For the officers who revisited the evidence in 2024, that truth gave their work renewed meaning. They felt pride, not in a personal way, but in the sense that careful, patient investigation could bring light to something that had been in shadow for far too long. In the months that followed the trial, small changes began to appear around the places Marina had spent time. A bookstore she used to visit created a tiny display with her favorite genre. A neighbor placed flowers outside the building where she had once lived, doing so not out of sadness but as a symbol of warmth and remembrance. These gestures were quiet, but they reflected the way a community carries someone forward when their life touched more people than they realized. Her family organized a yearly walk in her memory, choosing to focus on connection and healing rather than grief. They encouraged those who attended to remember Marina not for the case, but for the kindness she showed in her everyday life. Detective Warren, now nearing retirement, visited the trail where some of Marina's belongings had been found years earlier. He walked slowly, thinking of the long path the case had taken and how close it had come to remaining unanswered. The early years of the investigation had been shaped by limited resources and limited forensic tools, but he remembered every detail: the neighbors who had searched with flashlights, the volunteers who combed through wooded areas, the friends of Marina who sat with officers describing her habits and routines. For him, this resolution felt like carrying out a respectful duty. It reminded him why good investigators never fully close a case in their mind. Even when the file gets stored away, as seasons changed again across Idaho, Marina's story shifted from mystery to memory. The uncertainty that once surrounded her disappearance no longer shaped how people thought of her. Instead, they remembered her as someone who contributed warmth and sincerity to the people around her. The community learned once more the importance of never giving up on unanswered questions, especially when those questions involve a life full of quiet goodness. For Marina's parents, the resolution did not erase the years of longing, but it brought a stillness they had not felt in 20 years. They found comfort in knowing that truth had finally reached them, even if it had taken longer than anyone hoped. The detectives who worked on the case continued to talk about Marina during briefings and training sessions. They told new officers her story, not for sadness, but to explain the value of persistence and careful documentation. They described how one well-preserved piece of evidence, reviewed decades later, became the key that changed everything. In their voices was a respect for her family and a belief that every case, no matter how old, deserved attention. They hoped new generations of investigators would follow that same belief. On a quiet evening, Marina's brother visited the small wooden bench overlooking the river where she used to sit during summers. The water moved calmly beneath the fading daylight, carrying a sense of peace that felt deeper now. He placed a single flower on the bench, not as a symbol of loss but of gratitude for the time they had with her. He spoke softly, telling her that everything had finally been resolved, that the long journey toward truth had reached its end. As he stood and walked away, the evening breeze carried a feeling of closure that had once seemed impossible. Years later, people still spoke of Marina's case as an example of how careful forensic work can bridge decades. The DNA match that revealed the truth became a reminder of how science, patience, and determination can work together to bring clarity where there had once been silence. Her story became one that encouraged hope, even for families still waiting for their own answers. Through these conversations, Marina's name remained alive in a way that honored her life rather than the circumstances that ended it. Her kindness continued to shine through every memory shared in the end. The community remembered Marina for her sincerity, her laughter, and the quiet strength she carried. The resolution of her case brought a sense of calm to everyone who had followed it for years. They held on to the idea that truth, no matter how delayed, has the power to bring comfort and understanding. Marina's story stood as proof that every life leaves an imprint, and that the effort to honor that life is always worthwhile. The people who knew her, and even those who only knew of her, continued to carry her forward in a way that was gentle, respectful, and full of quiet light.